Let's take a look now at this second video related to the October Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, which of course we know on our calendar happens in early November. The October Revolution. You've got scenes here on the side that you've seen in previous videos of life in Russia, in Petrograd, St. Petersburg, prior to October. At the very top here, we've got just before the February Revolution, we've got our images of crowds gathering outside the Winter Palace, the legacy, if you like, of the Bloody Sunday incident. We've got the importance of women protesting, wanting reform to voting laws in Russia during the International Women's Day protests, again in late February 1917. And then, of course, we've got the issue of the army not being fully reliable to the provisional government during a period of, well, firstly to the Tsar in February 1917, and then after March to the provisional government, because the Tsar, of course, has abdicated at this point. A quick reminder that when we're talking about the October Revolution, we're really describing a revolution that takes place in the early hours of November 7th, 1917. Our context. Coming into October 1917, the provisional government's facing defeat at war with its army crumbling on different fronts. There's peasant rights in the countryside demanding reform to land ownership, demanding a say in the way the estates that they live on are run, and taking control of the land off aristocrats. There are food shortages in the cities, and I've stolen a line here from the TV show Game of Thrones, and winter is coming. We know winter is when food shortages are going to be completely exacerbated. It's going to be when transport networks are under most pressure in Russia because of the blizzards and the snow. So October is a time that's almost the crunch time climatically for Russia. The provisional government sees the issues arising. They're not doing nothing as so much is going wrong around them. The provisional government sets a timetable. They're going to call elections for the Constitutional Assembly. Their idea would be they're going to head off a revolution by carrying out these votes, satisfy lots of people, then there'll be a moderate domination of this Constitutional Assembly and the Bolshevik revolutionaries will be undercut. The revolutionaries of the Bolshevik movement certainly see the elections as a threat to the increased power of the Soviets across Russia. And they decide to step forward or to progress their plans to seize power again. Remember, they've already attempted to take power on 2 occasions previously. So the Bolsheviks announce a full meeting of the Bolshevik Party in Russia. It's going to be held in Petrograd on November 7th, 1917. As soon as they announce this Congress, this second all-party Congress, Bolsheviks gather in Petrograd. It's a signal, if you like, we're going to have this major convention of Bolsheviks come to Petrograd to be at our meeting. It's interesting they'd called one previous all-party Congress, and that was before their July attempt at taking power, which failed. So it's almost a signal that when they are calling an all-party Congress, they're going to try and seize power off the provisional government. So what actually happens on November 7th? In the early hours of the morning, on November 7th, 1917, Bolshevik Red Guards, and we've got images of them here that have just appeared on the screen. Bolshevik Red Guards, under the command of Trotsky, occupy all the key government buildings of Petrograd. Railways, post office, telephone exchanges, government buildings, police offices, military garrisons. By doing so, they're taking the levers of anything that could push back at them, taking the levers of power. Similar actions take place in all the significant cities and towns across Russia. They'll seize bridges, they'll seize railway stations, stopping troops moving about. They're essentially cutting off any attempt or any physical locations that can be used in an attempt to undermine their seizure of power, their revolution. In Petrograd, this is largely a bloodless coup. In other words, no one is killed. But in other areas such as Moscow, there's significant resistance and fighting that goes on for some time. Outside Petrograd itself, the Russian army splits into those that are going to be loyal to the Bolsheviks, aligned to the Soviets. These become known as the red units. And then there are white units that stay loyal to their commanders. Some of them are quite loyal to the Tsar. Some are loyal to the elected government, the provisional government. They want to stay in the traditional aristocratic-led armies, professional army units, and so on. But we've now got red versus white military units. The red are commanded by Leon Trotsky, and the white military units become the loose alliance of anti-Bolshevik forces that resist the Bolshevik Revolution into the Civil War era. In December, Lenin starts establishing a secret police force, the Cheka. And the Cheka carry out a period, or start a period, of hunting down enemies of the Bolsheviks. And this becomes known as the Red Terror. So looking at those couple of images before we move down any further into a sort of an illustration of what the Red Terror and the Civil War starts to play out like by 1918. The top image here is of Red Guard units in Petrograd in October 1917. The lower of the two units is Red Guard units in Moscow, again October 1917. Let's now explore a little bit more. Let's talk about the story that many of you heard of Anastasia Romanov, the Tsar's youngest daughter. You may have heard it from the Disney, I think it's Disney, maybe Pixar, show Anastasia. So what's happened to the Tsar? Well, after March 1917, Tsar Nicholas has abdicated. He's given up his crown. He is no longer royalty. He's known by his name, Nicholas Romanov. He and his family are moved from mansion to mansion in, let's say, protective custody by the provisional government. There's a sense that he will want to seize power back and re-establish a Tsarist autocracy. So he's under guard. They're saying for his own protection, but we can read a little bit into that to say perhaps it is more to keep an eye on him. Now, the Reds particularly fear when they take power that the Whites will want to restore the monarchy, to bring it back during the Civil War period. So after the October Revolution, the conditions of the imprisonment of the Tsar get stricter and the guards become more threatening, and they shift the Tsar and his family to a house of special purpose at Yekaterinburg in central Russia. It's right out where Russia almost, it's what Russians consider the border between European Russia and Asian Russia. It's in the center of Russia in the Ural Mountains. Now, it was incredibly isolated in the early parts of the Civil War, well away from where the active Western white forces were. Increasingly, this house of special purpose is converted into a prison by the Bolsheviks. And there are actually photographs of this house with its walls up and barricades around it. It goes from being a mansion, a dacha, into a prison. On the night of the 17th, 18th of July, 1918, the Tsar and his family, including the former Princess Anastasia and their dogs, are told that they are going to have a group photograph taken. Now, they'd been taunted, I'm pretty sure, that they would have been very suspicious of anyone telling them that they're just going to have their photograph taken. But they're taken to the basement for a staged photograph, and at that point, they're shot. And that's an image of the room in which they're shot. The doors were barricaded shut. There was no exit that way. It's interesting that at one point on one of the Anastasia's brothers, the bullet seemingly bounced off him. He put on a big heavy jacket and had actually hidden a lot of the family jewels inside the linings of the jacket. He thought they were going to be moved from place to place, put the jacket in. At first, the bullets bounced off the young prince's body, completely freaked out his guards, the firing squad, feeling that maybe the Tsar really did have divine powers after all. But they were shot in the basement of the house, and what happened to their bodies became a mystery for many decades. And this leads to the story of perhaps one, the Princess Anastasia, had escaped. And in fact, during the 1920s, there are people claiming to be Anastasia in the United States. And it becomes a bit of a worldwide mystery, conspiracy theory, if you like. But certainly by the 1990s, it had been confirmed that all of the bodies had been dumped into an unmarked grave at the roadside, because the truck the bodies were in kept getting bogged as they went into this forest. an unmarked grave at a roadside on their way to some copper mines that were going to be their dumping site underground. And so this is a little bit of a footnote to history of what happens to the Tsar. The execution of the Tsar, as I'm getting at here at this little point, and the change to the poster, sacrifice to the International, is one of the most significant events of this Civil War era. So when we look at this imagery here, coming out of 1918, again, we see that Tsarist crown of Mother Russia, her being sacrificed, the blood on Trotsky's knife, the bag of 30 pieces of silver held by a Jewish Judas betrayer is a reference to the German gold conspiracy theories surrounding Lenin's return to Russia. So there's quite a lot in this image. It's a very, very interesting one to practice your analysis on and to think through. So something I want to leave you with in the last couple of minutes is let you play with these two posters from the Civil War era. They both are images of Trotsky. They're both from opposite sides of the war. So one, and I don't want to say which, one is quite praising, glorifying, hero worshipping of Trotsky. The other portrays him as vile, brutal killer. Now, hopefully you've got a bit of a sense of which one's which already, but I don't really want to give that one away. So look at the task in the blue box I've got there. I've said analyse the two Civil War era posters. So one should be easy. You've done it before, Sacrifice the International. The other one, Trotsky slays the counter-revolutionary dragon, not so easy. I want you to play around with those images, do a little bit of research, analyse it, pull it apart. Remember, step one, look at the context statement. Step two, look at the source. Then identify the major features. Now, the question says analyse them. They were created by the opposing sides of the war. So think for a moment, who are those opposing sides? And that means we've got two perspectives here. In a paragraph, I want you to evaluate the reliability and usefulness to historians of these depictions of Trotsky. Base those decisions upon your own knowledge of Trotsky's role in the Bolshevik Party and the Revolution and the Civil War, who he was, what he did. Okay, now a few tips to help you reflect on what the ISMG asks you to do. I've worked parts of the ISMG criteria into that paragraph task. When you're asked to evaluate in an ISMG, the ISMG is calling for you to make a judgment, to express your view on the source's usefulness and or reliability. So given that these are from two different perspectives, you might actually think that they're both useful, but perhaps not totally trustworthy either of them, because they're both quite coloured by a personal bias, a political bias. Maybe they're actually opposed to each other. So they can be really useful in showing biases, but they might not be, or perspectives, if we use the task sheet and the ISMG words, useful in showing perspectives, but not necessarily giving a reliable, unbiased, historical view of the actual person of Trotsky. Think that one through as you deal with the sources. When you make your judgments in your exams, you have to be certain to support your judgment with reasoning and evidence. You can't just say Trotsky slays the counter-revolutionary dragon is unreliable. You'll need to say it's useful to historians because. Okay? You might want to say it's useful to historians because it's supported by another historian's point of view, and then we're corroborating. Okay, so think about how you might play with that and what you might do in exams. You should refer to the different perspectives. If you've got a white perspective and a red perspective, make sure you refer to them, okay? And perhaps even connect to them and introduce others if you like. By analysis, identify the key features. Consider the ADAMANT acronym we've been using. The author, the creator, the date, the context, what's going on at the time, the audience that's intended to see it, the messages, the agenda, the reasons underpinning the creation of this, the nature of the source. Is it propaganda? Is it a recruiting poster? Is it a diary entry? The nature of it. What techniques? exaggeration, using racial stereotypes. Anti-Semitism might be a clue for one of these. What techniques come through? Exaggeration. Okay. Now, don't try to analyze everything. The best analysis picks up on the most important choices and most important objectives or most important elements of the source. So be discerning, and that's a key word there. Make choices of what is more important to put in and what's important to. Maybe downplay. What are the best features? Now, synthesis is another skill we've got to develop. It's bringing elements of the sources together into one coherent whole. How do we go, while this source says this or shows this, the other does that? Think of these as somehow to be connected, to be blended. Something that's synthetic is a blend of more than one individual thing. So getting 2, 3 sources and blending them together in a sentence, drawing them together is an example of synthesis. So while Sacrifice of the International depicts Trotsky as this, it does so because Trotsky slays the counter-revolutionary dragon has a different perspective. So think about how you could take the 2 sources and talk about them together rather than separately. That's an example of how you might synthesize the information.